Welcome everyone. Hello. Welcome to our inaugural Ask Me Anything session. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Jagera and Turrbal people. On behalf of our team, I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present, who continue their cultural and spiritual connections to country. This land has been a place of important teaching and learning for many thousands of years. This evening's topic is facial recognition, as you know, and this is your opportunity to ask all of your burning questions to these wonderful experts, from the technical side to the legal, ethical issues. My name is Caitlin Curtis. I'm from the UQ School of Business, and I'm going to be moderating our event. And I'm really excited. I think this is going to be a great discussion. So this is the inaugural Ask Me Anything, but we are going to run these sessions once every 2 months. So we'll follow this session up with an email to give you more details about that and our other events for the UQ AI Collaboratory, including our launch event. So if you have topics that you'd like to talk about in AI, please let us know. We would love to hear from you. So the way today's going to work, we've got a 60-minute session, and then those of you that are here, we should be having pizza afterwards, so we can continue that conversation. We'll start off with the questions that you've pre-submitted. First, we'll have a short video, and then in the final 20 minutes or so, I'll open it up live. So if you have questions that accumulate as we go along, just keep them in mind, jot them down. We'll get to them at the end. If you're joining us on Zoom, you can ask the questions that you have in the Q&A box. So to get started, I'd like to introduce our panel. First, on my right, I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Brian Lovell. We're very fortunate to have Brian here. He's a distinguished world-class expert in artificial intelligence, particularly in the fields of pattern matching and facial recognition, as you would have seen on his bio when you registered. Not only is he doing academic research, but we're also going to see a video from one of his industry partners, FaceWatch, about the application of one of these technologies. Brian's also the project leader of the Advanced Surveillance Group at UQ. And on my left, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor John Swinson. We're also very fortunate to have him with us. John is both a lawyer and a scholar. He's a professor in the T.C. Burns School of Law here at UQ, and was also a partner in the prestigious international law firm, King & Wood Mallesons. And John's legal expertise covers privacy, cybersecurity, and AI, among other areas. And he's also written several legal guides to help businesses understand the legalities of AI and facial recognition. So welcome to you both, and thanks for being here. And I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And to kick off, we will show a little provocative video kind of setting the stage. Oh, it's queued up. Here we go.
Hi, my name is Chirag, and I'm the store manager at Nisa Local Borough. Before we had FaceWatch, we were struggling to manage crime in our premises. But since we've had FaceWatch installed, it has made a massive improvement and our crime levels have dropped drastically. So FaceWatch is super easy to use. It's very user-friendly. It takes less than a minute to report a crime that's occurred in your premises. And once a crime has been reported, it is instantly put onto their servers. So next time the offender comes to the premises, you get alerted instantly, so you can get all the information that is required for you to know exactly who that offender is and stay on top of it so the crime does not occur again. The staff really like it. It's a vital tool, and frankly, we'll be lost without it. The customers love that we have it because it makes them feel safe whilst they're in our premises. The installation process was quick, tidy, and it was very professional, and the good thing was they didn't get in the way to disrupt any business. The information added to the database is shared to the local area, benefiting the community. If you're considering FaceWatch, I would highly recommend it because it is a massive deterrent for any crimes that may occur within your premises.
So FaceWatch, that's really a demonstration of one application of this technology. It's powered by current UQ Research, an industry partner of Professor Lovell's. So that really kind of gets me thinking, with any kind of technology, there's positive and negative uses. And Brian, I know that you were on a World Economic Forum committee that was sort of thinking about these issues. And I wonder, in your view, what are some of sort of the good and bad uses of these technologies, facial recognition technology?
Well, in discussions with the World Economic Forum, their example of a bad use of the technology was to find a particular group, or perhaps an ethnic group, and then discriminate against them. So that's we can be considered some of the worst uses of the technology. An example of a good use of the technology would be for faster border control. So in border control applications where people are able to go through the borders much faster with face recognition, and Australia is a world leader in that area. Another good example would be using face to identify patients so that you give them the correct medicines in hospital. Because you might know that a lot of people who go to hospital can be injured or even die if they're given the wrong medicine. So if you could quickly identifying patients and making sure you're dealing with the right person is a big plus in hospitals. So it's not the technology, it's sort of the uses of the technology that define whether it's ethical or not.
Yeah, thank you for that. John, do you have anything to add?
It's interesting when you're looking at facial recognition and artificial intelligence. The question that's often asked is it legal? And to reflect on what Brian just said, it's like asking, is a hammer legal? A hammer can be used for good things or for bad things. So you can build a building or you can hit someone on the head. And so you can't really ask, is a hammer legal? Does it make sense? It's just like asking, is AI in facial recognition legal? It can be put to good uses and bad uses. So that's one of the difficulties. It's clearly not good, clearly not always good, and clearly not always bad.
Yeah, excellent. And that kind of leads to my follow-up question around this video in particular. In this setting, this was taking place in the UK. But what about these systems when they're in Australia? What are some of the legal issues there? I imagine maybe privacy, but do we have specific legislation around face recognition in Australia?
For the most part, there's no specific legislation about facial recognition or artificial intelligence, for that matter. Most of the laws we have are technology neutral, so they're trying to apply to all aspects of technology. Otherwise, every time there's a new technology or an upgrade to your iPhone, the law might have to change. So you're trying to have long-term general laws that apply regardless of the technology. So just like contract law, for the most part, doesn't distinguish about whether you're buying an iPhone or whether you're buying a truck. It's a contract, and the subject matter is neutral for the most part. There are exceptions to that, but for the most part, it's subject matter neutral. And so the laws are subject matter neutral. But you mentioned privacy law, and privacy law is very relevant to artificial intelligence and facial recognition. And there was a case just last week, which you might have seen, it's got some publicity, where the 7-Eleven stores were prosecuted by the Privacy Commissioner, by the Australian Privacy Commissioner, for using facial recognition in the stores. And the way it worked, so 7-Eleven's got about 700 stores, and for about 14 months, starting in June last year, they had iPads where you could answer survey questions about your experience in the store. Is the store clean? Did you get good service? Those kinds of activities. And as part of that, when you answered the survey, the iPad took your photograph without you knowing when you first started the survey and when you finished the survey. And those photographs got uploaded into the Azure cloud, and then they were run through an algorithm to develop a face print, which gives an algorithmic representation of your face. And then they were used for a number of purposes. One, to determine whether someone answered lots of surveys. They didn't want, say, a staff member, when the store was slow, going in and entering lots of survey questions in a row, saying how good the staff was and how clean the store was, because that would be unreliable results. So the facial recognition could determine whether it was the same person just answering questions over and over. And it was also used to determine the age and the sex of the person who was entering the data. And the Privacy Commissioner said that was a breach because it wasn't clearly wasn't notified clearly that facial recognition was being used for this purpose, that this information is being used for this purpose. And because facial recognition is regarded under privacy law as being sensitive information, just like medical information, so there's a higher standard, the Privacy Commissioner said, look, there could have been better ways to collect this information and to do these tasks. And so, for example, to work out someone's age and sex, it would have been easier just to ask them their age range and their sex rather than have the computer to do it. And there could have been other ways to stop cheating. And so 7-Eleven was found to be in breach of privacy law and had to stop using the system and destroy all the photographs and face prints that they collected over this period. So they collected about 1.6 million. And so I think partly because it was so many and it wasn't clear that this was happening, the Privacy Commissioner went down very heavy on 7-Eleven stores. And I noticed in the video that Brian showed, there was a sign up that said CCTV camera and facial recognition being used, whereas the 7-Eleven stores just had CCTV camera and didn't make it clear that facial recognition was being used, so you wouldn't know.
Yeah, that's a great example. It really makes it concrete how these things can go right and how these things can go wrong.
And so the clear part, and lawyers have been saying this for a long time, if you're going to be using facial recognition, make it clear that you're doing this. Make sure that the person who's the subject of it, at least as far as businesses are doing it, and make it clear and give people the ability to opt out. And so that could be, well, don't come into the store if you're not happy with this, or on the iPad you could say, no, don't collect my face image.
Yeah.
And so put the power back into control of the consumer.
Yeah. Thank you both. Now for the moment you've all been waiting for, we're going to jump to the audience questions. Let me get right to the first one. Quite a few people asked around this. Google in particular asked, how reliable is face recognition technology? And just to lump things together, a few people also asked about its accuracy, but Brian, would you like to start speaking to this? How reliable is face recognition technology?
If we're talking about reliable in terms of accuracy, in terms of identification, it's improved massively over the last, say, 5 years since the advent of AI. And that's why this is an AI talk. It's one area that's shot forward massively in terms of performance. And so now it's generally well above human performance, certainly in speed, but also in actual identification accuracy. Humans are pretty good at identifying people they know very well, like family members or even themselves, but they're not actually that good at recognizing people they've never seen before. And certainly in that situation, like the passport barrier, the face recognition is much more accurate than trained passport officers and so on. And so now passports have a problem that if the face recognition says there's a match, how do they get a better indication of that? Because the humans can't tell, and they can't tell if there's a match either. So, you used to be able to say the human could tell, but now it's better than the human. So what do you use to check the computer system?
Yeah, excellent. And I guess that kind of sparked a thought. Are there implications then when facial recognition systems or sort of known instances where there has been a little bit of non-accuracy or someone gets misidentified?
Yeah, so you have to look at what the application is. If someone gets misidentified in a 7-Eleven survey, it's not the end of the world. But if you're using it, say, for a lineup, replacing it for someone who's been arrested, and you're trying to identify whether the person who's been arrested was the one who was at the scene of the crime, you want it to be 100% accurate. But the trouble is, as Brian was suggesting, lineups are notoriously inaccurate. People have got bad recollection, particularly if you're the victim of a crime because you're in a stressful situation. And so,
Or you have eyes like mine.
or bad eyesight or bad lighting conditions. And so facial recognition would more likely be more accurate if you've got a good image to look at. The question is, if you've got a computer making the decision here, how transparent is it? Is it something that a jury or a judge could rely upon and say, there's a magic black box that Brian's developed, but he says it's very accurate, but we don't know how it's actually come to this conclusion? And is that something that the average jury would be happy to rely upon, or because it's so complex to understand, would people not accept it? And in the early days, fingerprints weren't accepted. People looked at that and said fingerprints were like, how could we rely upon a fingerprint to determine that it was someone who'd been at the scene of a crime, and then it's slowly been accepted. So I'm suspecting that over time, as it becomes more common, people will start to accept it, provided it's from a reliable provider who's been tested,
Yeah.
independently. But I think in the early days, I think the jury might hesitate to convict based upon facial recognition. Brian, do you? If you're on the jury and you had a friend who was up on a crime,
charge, look, there certainly will be mistakes. Sometimes the mistakes, very obvious to the person looking, but if you can just dismiss it. And that's one of the good things about face recognition, that generally, if it does something really stupid, a human can very quickly do that, which we can't do with a fingerprint or other identification means where you need to rely on an expert, but each one of us can do facial recognition. So the cost, if you design the system well, the cost of an error can be quite low, because you say, oh, that's obviously wrong, we can dismiss that. The other thing is there's usually multiple ways to identify somebody. So the good thing about facial recognition is that you can say this person seems to match, and then you can possibly gather extra information about them. One example I know about was a fellow who was in the London riots, and the CCTV showed the person. You couldn't really identify him by facial recognition because the quality was low, but what happened is that this person dropped a cup into a bin. And so they were able to get DNA from the person from the cup in the bin, and this was able to identify the person. So sometimes you can often get secondary information. And certainly if you go to the border and it says you're not matched, I mean, all you have to do is pull out your driver's license or something else, some secondary form. So it really, I question facial recognition by itself, but if it's combined with other factors, then it becomes much more reliable. Even the famous fingerprint problem. I mean, in the Madrid bombing, the Americans put an ex-Marine in jail for 2 years because his fingerprints matched the bomber in Madrid, until it turned out they actually caught the real bomber, and that match was completely false. But this guy was in the jail for 2 years. So all these systems have an error rate. You have to build systems that allow for that.
Let's see. This is a really popular question we have here. Samantha, Candice, and Xingyu are curious to know how does facial recognition work with masks?
With masks, that's been a big research topic since COVID started. Originally, masks were confined to some places in Asia. Was not common across the world, but of course, with the COVID, there's mask wearing right across the world, and that meant that systems that have been developed for 30 years were effectively toast, and all these systems had to be redesigned. So this month, I believe they're having a big, scientific test on, detection of people with masks. And now that that's a problem, we're getting really good results. So detecting people with masks has gone up in the state-of-the-art systems from about 25% to about 80% in the last year or so, largely because they just didn't know about masks. They weren't trained on masks, and now they're training systems with masks. And that's one thing we're doing in our group, improving mask recognition. And you can see in that video, that's part of the results, was that people are wearing masks in those UK stores.
So in the store, it actually said you must wear a mask to go into the store.
Yes, it does. So we have to do something with masks. So maybe this is a short-term problem, maybe it's a long-term problem, but at the moment, a lot of customers are wearing masks. And that's been a big research thrust in the systems. The funny thing is that some masks, I have an iPhone, and some masks actually work with my iPhone. Like Sway's black mask, the UQ standard mask actually works. And that's you've got a fern on yours, a little bit different. But if you wear glasses and a mask, then it doesn't work for opening your phone. And so this is a real problem when everyone's supposed to use their phone for checking in at every single room they visit. So and it's very interesting. So this is not the security side of face recognition. This is about the convenience side of face recognition, where it's a very quick, easy way to open your phone.
That's really interesting. Our next question is from Laura. I'll ask you both maybe in turn. What unexpected impacts do you think facial recognition technology is going to have on our lives in the next 10 years?
I think what will happen is that instead of logging in with passwords on all systems, we'll be looking at face type login. It's just the right way to do things, because you just look at the device and you're recognized. There you have two forms of security. One form of security is access to your personal device, like your phone, so it's artifact security, just like a key. And the second thing is your face. And the nice thing is, as soon as you look at the device, you're authenticated. And this is where Apple's going. And I think this will also extend to desktops and other systems. There's a Hello system with Windows that works like that. But we're all getting absolutely frustrated with logging into systems and proving who we are. And a survey that I often quote is from Imperial College, where they said that each of us spends 3 weeks of the working year authenticating ourselves to systems. And you know, this morning I'd lost my password, and it took me about an hour or so to recover it. You add up all those events in your life, just trying to get access to systems. It's a huge amount of work wasted there compared to just looking at the device and being authenticated.
So clawing back some time.
Yeah, it's wasted time. You know, and let you think of that. If you think of all the people working in the world, they're spending 3 weeks just authenticating themselves to computer systems. Could we claw that? You know, get that down to one week instead of 3 weeks. I think that's a tremendous use of face recognition, and you know, that's something I really value. So it's not so much about, you know, it's easy security as opposed to hard security, which is, you know, when I try to pay a bill, I have to type in a 6-letter password with, you know, special characters and everything on my phone, and it's really slow. So.
One thing about facial recognition is what I'm going to call the network effect. If you've got 10 telephones in the world and that's all you've got, it's not very, very useful. But if everyone has a telephone, that's very useful. And what's happened with facial recognition, or what's I think will happen with facial recognition, is we've got huge numbers of CCTV cameras and cameras now existing. Most people have got Amazon kind of devices in their house, which have got cameras built in. Your laptop's got a camera built in. The University of Queensland has got CCTV cameras everywhere. I looked around this room, I can't actually see a CCTV.
We're all looking around.
So, but there's mostly, and so if you've got huge amounts of, is that?
Yeah, that's one. Right over your head.
Yeah, and I don't know who's watching on all of these things. I think it's someone back in the security office determining whether my lectures are interesting or not, and then reporting me back to the vice chancellor. I'm not actually sure. I speak to the camera sometimes and ask questions, but they never respond. And so when you've got so many cameras, I think there's going to be applications that we haven't even thought of. And so people are talking about security and surveillance, but I think there'll be other applications that are just so unusual that we haven't dreamed of. So everyone's got phones, and then suddenly we're sending text messages. No one invented the phone to do text messages, but people are sending more text messages and making phone calls, and that was a byproduct. I think we're going to have something like that that's just going to come out unexpectedly and be something which is going to be a really incredible thing because of all the cameras and the technology behind it.
Yeah.
We just don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But just to add one point, nobody watches the cameras. Generally, there's too many cameras, and they might look at them to see if they're working, but generally nobody sits there watching cameras in most installations. So there was a tragic case in a US court where a woman was being held up and she was screaming at the camera, you know, thinking there's somebody watching, and she was shot or something in the court room. But you know, she thought there's somebody watching. There's no one watching. It's the only time people will watch when they say something's stolen from this room on a certain date. They'll then look at the camera after the event. So nobody does things preemptively. They do it after the. You know, it's reported by some of the means.
I was in Woolworths at Toowong before it got closed down. And a lady had her handbag stolen out of her trolley when she was shopping. So she went to the service desk and said, "Could you pull up the video to show who's got?" He said, "They're all fake cameras. They're not actually connected to anything. We've just got it for deterrence purposes." And so not even cameras in some places.
That legally, that's incredibly dangerous to do. For, the problem, that question was asked about whether they use fake cameras. And the problem is that if you put a camera up, you're acknowledging that there's a need for cameras. And then if you actually put fake cameras up, you're saying you're aware that you should have had the cameras and you haven't put them in. And if something happens, it can be massive lawsuits. That was actually the answer from the head of the Marriott Hotel Security. So they never use fake cameras because of the legal implications.
Well, that Woolworths has been demolished. So
yeah, well, they escaped.
I've got another popular question. Jin Yang, can face recognition tell the difference between twins, and how?
Yes, it can tell the difference between twins sometimes. It's unreliable. Theoretically, twins should look the same, and to most of us, they look very similar. But if you look at the twins, they're often slightly different weights, and they may have had slightly different experiences. One might have been in Queensland, one might have been in Melbourne with different skin conditions and so on. So there can be differences, even though they're genetically the same due to environmental effects or other effects. So you often, we've done this. You can tell them apart, but not reliably. Generally, if they're twins, you'd have to use some other mechanism to resolve them. So that's it's a fact of face recognition compared to iris recognition or fingerprint recognition, because your fingerprints aren't determined by your DNA and your iris is not. The pattern is formed chaotically during in the womb, whereas with face recognition, it's determined by the DNA. So same DNA means same face.
All right, and we've got one from Greta. How can we develop international safeguards regime? Who wants to tackle that one? That's a big question.
Well, I mean, World Economic Forum was actually tasked by the French government to look at ethical and unethical uses of face recognition, because they wanted to have some sort of broader policy that could be agreed at the EU level on the usage. So, I mean, this is how these things tend to happen, either at a national level or at a transnational level. Someone comes up with some things, and of course, it's driven by the bad examples where things are used badly. And I think there's an acceptance of face recognition coming in. In fact, anyone with an iPhone or an Android phone has face recognition in their pocket, so it's certainly in already. But it's still very early days of adoption.
Yeah, I think things are being done more at the local level rather than the international level for the most part. So for most laws that are coming in, there's a human rights assessment, sometimes a privacy assessment done on the law before it's passed, and that's all laws. And so, and a lot of the COVID laws actually failed for human rights and privacy assessments, but they still went through. So you've got that. Some of the big corporations, Microsoft, Google, and so on, are limiting who they provide the technology to, or actually limiting release of the technology so that they can be used for what they consider appropriate purposes. And so you've got interest groups watching what's going on. And so, for example, Amazon had a doorbell called the Ring doorbell. I don't think it was available in Australia. And so it's got a camera on it. And the camera, so you can sit in your house and look to see who's at the door. What they were doing in the US was selling the images from your doorbell camera to the police. And so they had contracts with 300 police departments, which they call partnerships, but I think the more sales contracts were selling it to the police, so the police could see what's happening on people's doorsteps. And there was a massive complaint raised by that, and Amazon stopped that practice. And so they stopped what would have been a profitable business line that they thought was for a good social purpose, which was security, because a number of issues were raised about privacy and discrimination and racial profiling and so on. And so you've got various people looking at these issues. It's not something where I think it's people getting away scot-free, but it's not being done by the United Nations for the most part, even though there are some setting high-level ethical rules. It's probably being done at the grassroots level.
I mean, the Ring doorbell has person detection, but this is the primary aim, and why I put it in was package delivery, so that you know when somebody's dropped something at your front door, so you don't just leave it there for someone to steal. You sort of can then act and collect the package. But it has solved a number of crimes, maybe through the police or just individuals, where people. I know one example: somebody had their car stolen, so the camera picked up the car being stolen.
Well, that kind of, I think, segues nicely into our next question from Helen. How do you design it so it is not creepy and unduly impacting privacy? Jamie had a similar question. What are some of the best practices to protect privacy with face recognition?
So when you're looking at creepiness, that's often, I hear it a lot in law school classes when you're talking about privacy, because you're trying to come up with a test of what seems right and what's wrong. And so people say, well, I think that's creepy, or I think that's okay. Different people have different views on what's creepy. your grandmother might have a different view of privacy and creepiness to a 16-year-old at high school. So it's not actually a reliable test, but it's a word that people often use when they're talking about privacy things. And I think you could say, like the 7-Eleven example, where you have your iPad secretly recording you, it's slightly creepy, but the use that they're putting to is probably not too bad. There was an Italian company selling mannequins for hanging clothes in retail stores where the eyes were actually cameras, and they fed into a system that did facial recognition and tried to track people's consumer habits and how long did you stand in certain clothes types. And that was regarded as creepy, and the company just didn't sell many mannequins because the stores just felt uncomfortable putting that in. It probably wasn't illegal if they put the right signage up and so on, but it just seemed like the wrong thing to do, and it probably scared the customers away rather than help customers. And so, when you're looking at the technology, it's often not the technology, but the context when it's used. So if you had a camera that was blatant with a big sign under it, like in Brian's video, that's different to secretly hiding a camera in the eyes of a model. And so it's a context which it's being used is I think important, which is not a technology issue.
No, it's how it's done. I also think one of the creepy facts about face recognition is it can be used to make inanimate objects seem animate. If you think of a person or if you go past a lizard or a dog, they look at you and they know they're aware of you, and their eyes track you. And normally machines don't do that. But once you add facial recognition, you start, with systems that start talking to you, and they know who you are. And I think that's a creepy factor. People. Well, I've got Alexa in my house. My wife thinks that's creepy too, and there's good reasons to think it both ways. But it is, at least it stops me humming, because I can just call out the name of the song I'm humming, then I get the real version. So there's one advantage.
Here's a quick one, maybe. Jeanette, how long does it take to read one's face?
You can do about, easily do 100,000 persons per second. So you can do things very fast with the right hardware. So it can be considered to be instantaneous.
Do you have to have a good photo to do that when you do it, or what's the source when you say 100,000?
Yeah, I'm thinking of a scalable system with like 20 cameras in an airport or something.
In a crowd.
Like yes, so the sort of tender documents saying they need to do that many faces. So you can typically, one camera, you might have 9 or so people in the photograph at a time, and a surveillance camera, and then you might have many cameras. So systems can, airport systems can be scaled to handle very large numbers. But it can be done very fast.
One of the applications that people have been talking about, they tried to pass laws in the Commonwealth level that failed, was using the driver's license databases of photographs to create a database that can be used for facial recognition. So if someone's committed a crime, they have a photograph taken the CCTV camera, they run it through a driver's license database. It's to they're using photographs that have been collected, not in greater circumstances. How, if you had someone's photograph and you've got every Australian's driver's license, how long would it take to identify someone?
Well, with those sort of numbers, so you're looking at being able to search very large databases almost instantaneously. So the technologies, obviously it depends how much hardware you throw at it, but I'm talking about not very expensive hardware at the government level to be able to search those sort of databases almost instantly. So the problem is, as you increase the size of the database, the risk of a bad match goes up, and that's exactly what happened in the Madrid bomber case. They used a huge number of face databases, and because they had so many databases, randomly somebody matched. And because all of the Marines and all the military in the US had their fingerprints taken, a large percentage of the database was full of ex-military. So the match happened to be an ex-military person, and who had nothing to do with the Madrid bombing.
It's interesting, the federal system, or the system that's going to be a federal database, they scrapped that, and instead of having a decentralized database where you send the photograph to each of the states to do it, so it's going to be to stop creating one database. In New South Wales, instead, they're using it to filter and then it goes to a human to look at. So rather than having the computer decide, the computer might select the 10 closest matches and then a human looks at it and then they hand it across to a police investigator to actually do it. So using it from a filtering point of view.
Yes, it's also to not stop undermining the system. If for example, it says that it was a Caucasian male and they wound up with a Asian female coming up in the maps, they don't want to show that to the Mr. Plot and the police. So those sorts of errors can come up, and so an expert will basically try to get rid of the worst of the offences. And I believe they do something like that with the face lock system as well, to sort of stop stupid matches coming out. So all you're left with is plausible matches.
Yeah.
Usually when police identify somebody, they have something like a person about 6 foot tall, male, something like that. They try to make sure that that context is matched.
Well, that kind of relates to our next question. Susan, thinking about research here at UQ, to what extent are the diverse aspects of human faces embraced in AI face recognition at UQ? Yeah, I'm taking diverse here as a key word for demographics. There's certainly a lot of differences. I mean, this is long research going on in here with, in the recent tests that are just happening this month, I think, they've got the database separated into young people, masked, that's under 18, masked people, Southern Asian, which is Indian people, Eastern Asian, which is Chinese people, and so on. And they're checking on each of these subsets to make sure that the accuracy is quite good. In my view, the accuracy is quite good across a wide range of demographics, but I think it's in some people's interest to claim that there's lots of problems, but the problem's much less, I think much less than any human being who tries to do face recognition. Because I'd be, they say that you're very good at recognizing people who look like your parents. And that's pretty much the case, that if you're from a certain ethnic group, you'll be better off at recognizing people from that group than other groups, and you can't change that. The computer, at least the computer can be even-handed. I think if anyone has a question, we have many more questions to get through, but I promised at the end that people could ask live questions. Sorry?
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, right.
With isolation, what's called the quarantine time, I didn't share my face. Use my iPhone. And gradually, every day I change a little bit. And the day is recognized me. When I finish my quarantine, I just share the link because I want to go out to stay people. And suddenly, this stop to recognize myself. Because little by little changes, But suddenly I share everything, no fear.
I'll just repeat that.
Yeah.
For the people on Zoom, if you couldn't hear, if there are little incremental changes, maybe can the system handle that better than a large change like shaving off your beard?
It depends on the design of the system. If the system allows an update of the identity, and I think Apple doesn't tell you what they're doing, but Apple quite likely, when each time you get identified, it basically says, is this a little bit different from before, and it might track it. And then when you have a sudden change, like you shave all your hair off, then there may be some problem because the model's drifted. Other systems, like policing systems, typically they won't update. They'll just keep that fixed. So that's really a matter of choice. And if obviously the systems are pretty good, but occasionally they'll get things wrong. But it depends. It's really a matter of whether you update the reference model or not.
I can figure that. I have to start the Python like possible.
It's a clever aspect of the Apple design. I'm not that familiar with the Android, but it actually, for various reasons, it asks you your password on a regular basis. And sometimes you can't use faces, so you don't forget your password. So it's a good user design. But it doesn't ask you it enough to be annoying, but enough so that you remember.
Does the Apple phone do a 3D scan or a 2D scan of your face?
Both. Yeah, it's very sophisticated. The Apple phone, first thing it does is it has a distance sensor, and it detects if there's something close to the phone. And if it does that, then it turns on the face recognition. So this is to save power. So it has an infrared flood, which just lights you up at night, so it works at night. and then it has the speckle projector, which lets it get the 3D. So those things cost a lot to run, so it doesn't turn them on until it actually detects a face. And so this all happens in a very short period of time, and it's all the top bar of the phone. But it does 3D recognition and 2D recognition, plus at night it's of course using the infrared, possibly in daytime as well.
Oh, that's excellent. Agnes had the same question, and also around facial recognition, straight on view versus profiles. Is that?
Yeah, typically with AI systems, they learn all those different angles, and which is a remarkable improvement over traditional techniques. That it can learn like a motor vehicle from all angles or a face from all angles, and so it doesn't actually detect the angle and then change the model. It just like we can recognize it a wide range, and so the modern systems typically can handle very wide pose variations.
20 years ago, there was facial recognition without AI. Now there's facial. What does the AI add to facial recognition that we didn't have before? What's the
accuracy primarily? We couldn't get beyond a certain level of accuracy with traditional shallow methods, but with these deep methods, the accuracy's gone up enormously, and that's both for the detection and for recognition. And so that's why, I think back in 2015, we're saying it's the golden age of face recognition, because it was always something that was highly desirable, but technologies like fingerprint recognition were much more accurate. Whereas now, I'd say face is more accurate than fingerprint recognition and more inclusive, because fingerprint recognition only works for about 95% of the population, and it doesn't work for the others because of their pores and their skin, whereas face is universal. You sort of have to have a face.
Does the iPhone use AI?
Yes, very definitely. I think all systems now would be AI based.
So we're carrying around an AI machine in our pockets.
Yes, and in fact, they brag about that. They talk about the neural engines. Yeah, designed to quickly do AI type processing. Well, basically convolutional neural networks.
Question. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So at that stage, I guess, when you talk about how COVID masks was difficulty with recognition, then I was curious. So, like, what are the big problems are there? So, like, we improved accuracy since 2015 with the CNN, and so what big problems in facial recognition are recent?
Right now.
What big problems in facial recognition are being researched and addressed right now?
Okay, at the research level, of course, sensitivity to masks is a large issue. In general, surveillance recognition is much harder than like iPhone recognition, like very low resolution images, blurry images, H.265 artifacts. There's a whole bunch of problems with the surveillance video, and it's hard to train because surveillance video data sets aren't online because of privacy issues. So there's no public surveillance data sets that are very large. So that's one thing. Most of the faces people get are off the internet, which is considered to be unethical, but that's where they come from. And people, when they upload a photo to the internet, they don't upload bad photos; they upload good photos. Whereas with CCTV, you get every sort of photo. It's a much wider range. And this is one reason we're looking a lot at face quality. We try to pick the best of the images. Yeah. So surveillance. I say border control is done. It works really well. It's been deployed in Australia and so on. And that's a commercial system. Then obviously phone unlock is pretty much done now. Surveillance CCTV is probably the last border, last big goal.
If I was going to do a PhD in 3 years in AI and facial recognition, what would I be doing there? What's a likely topic? Or what should I be doing?
There's facial recognition, and there's a whole bunch of face-related technologies. We've done some work on like emotion recognition and so on with faces. So faces are very interesting things. They're the human communication center. We use face recognition all the time in context switching. So if I see you, John, I'll go to the staff bar, down to the St. Lucy's or something, and I'll see you, and I instantly recognize you, and then suddenly, strangely, all the things I wanted to talk to you about come into my head, and which jokes I've told you, all that. You do a lot of context switching so fast, and then have a conversation. It's quite interesting. And I also find what's interesting sometimes is what you do before you even identify someone. Because when you identify a large distance, generally it's with the male or female, and that sort of thing. And that's the first thing you do when you see someone. You behave differently depending upon that. And then, in occasions when you can't tell, it really does your head in. It's hard to have a conversation because that's the question your brain's asking all the time. It's the first thing you need to know. Yeah. So that's so there's a lot of work on male-female. Male-female identification. It's interesting that makeup doesn't seem to affect female identification very much. There's some studies and people thought that was a big problem. It doesn't turn out to be an issue. Sunglasses are a big issue because they cover up the parts of the face that are mostly used for identification. So identification comes from the periocular region around the eyes. And so normal, these sort of glasses are fine, but Tom Cruise's aviators, they're a problem. And that's why movie stars wear them, so they can't be recognized.
That's interesting.
You mentioned characteristics. I've had legal questions where employers of large numbers of employees videotape the first interview. So you get interviewed by a computer in effect, you get filmed, and then you get marked by the AI machine, which is doing facial recognition, trying to determine if you're an honest person or a hardworking person. How accurate are those kind of, because that's not really facial recognition.
No, it's expression recognition and so on. I don't know how accurate it is because it's often hard if somebody pretends to be angry. Are they really angry? Because it's very hard to get genuine photos of somebody who's angry. They sort of put on their angry face. It's like a false smile, which isn't a genuine smile. So there's that aspect of it. An interesting application of that was in military training where you're doing some sort of gaming, and if you're looking at the person, you can sort of get some indication of how stressed they are, which could be a useful indicator for how good they'd be in the field. And so there's some work in that area, I know, but that's interesting. Or even driving tests. Try to work out how relaxed the person is when they're doing their driving tests online. So that these are, there's not face recognition so much. That's basically facial expression.
I've got a couple of questions here from Zoom. What about people who have had face surgery?
Yes, they can be difficult to recognise, just as it is for humans. And there have been cases there when people do that. It's fairly, for all systems, there's a way to get around it. Facial surgery works for humans. It will work for these systems as well, and making it difficult. The masks aren't such a problem because masks can only be added to the face. And so typically somebody wearing a mask won't be misrecognized, but with facial surgery, you can basically add to the face and subtract from the face, and it will cause problems. So yeah, then there's always a need for some other form of identification.
Yeah. And how can we improve these systems for low resolution images? Is another question.
Yeah, they do. Well, CCTV is low resolution, often only about 16 pixels across the eyes compared to photography, which is like 100 pixels. But it works quite well for low resolution. I've seen remarkable results on low resolution, but it's always going to fail at some point because if you get the resolution low enough, each one of us becomes a flesh-colored pixel, and we all look the same. So what it means is that people are less distinguished as you reduce the resolution.
Yeah. Someone else had a question that involved low light scenarios.
Well, low light for us is not necessarily low light for a surveillance camera. I've seen some tests of surveillance cameras where it looks completely dark to me, and yet with the surveillance camera you can actually see in the dark even without infrared. So so when you say low light, if you've got a camera like that can work in those conditions.
And what ethical aspects are purposely adhered to when developing face recognition through AI at UQ?
Well, there is an ethics position that came out in 2019 about the use of faces without consent, which does affect, I suppose, research in this area. And this is one reason we're doing a lot of work with synthetic faces. So you can now generate faces that are indistinguishable from real faces. And so one thing we're working on is how to build face recognition databases from totally synthetic faces. And this gets around the problem of getting consent, because we can generate 1 million faces in a day. Whereas photographing 1 million people, you imagine getting them all signed consent forms and everything. That would be a terrible thing, especially in the middle of COVID. So there is some work in ethical face recognition where they don't use stuff from the internet, but then you have to generate the faces.
So you're having computer AI generate faces and other computer AIs.
Yes, the question is it as good as real faces? Probably not, but the good thing is you can generate lots of them. And from our point of view, for surveillance, you can generate faces that are sort of bad quality and so on, that simulate the environment of a CCTV camera. So that if you can understand that, then you can just generate lots of data, because these systems need lots of data for training and testing. And so this is still a very new area. There's a ethical problem with gathering faces off the internet. You know, people may not have consented to having faces used for these purposes, and there's no way to actually find which people are in the database. There's also, I don't believe Australia has slap laws. You're probably familiar with those, where if you're a celebrity, you have a different level of privacy compared to normal people. But I don't think that there's such laws in Australia. So basically, Brad Pitt has as much right as anybody else to his privacy. And so a lot of the US systems use celebrity data sets because of the slap laws, that you can sort of do what you like with those faces in US law.
Do you have anything to add on to the ethical systems, practices and processes that we follow here at UQ?
No, I don't do research in that area, so I don't get that. But just as a general point, one of the issues about AI is how do you collect massive data sets? So regardless of what we do. So another problem, one of the law school academics was wanting to collect data sets of as many contracts. So you could do AI on contracts and determine what are good contracts and what are bad contracts, for example, or what. But you have to then collect who's going to donate their contracts.
Well,
typically
they're not donated. What happens is that the things you're interested in training on have been put up on the internet already, and people just harvest them, which is called internet scraping.
Yeah.
So faces, of course, are all over the internet, and people have written special tools to harvest them, but that's considered unethical because you can't get consent. And you've got, having access to something is very, very different from having legal access or legal right to something.
And so I think holding back AI is getting access to big data sets that you can legally use.
I do want to be sure I get. Did you have a question? Yeah.
I was wondering if the background to one of the first things said, where the example, like bad facial recognition, was recognized as a technique minority, but the example of good facial recognition is letting someone go forward. Aren't those sort of fundamentally the same operation? Okay. Where does that difference lie? Like, at what point does that come back? Right.
What's the relationship, sort of interconnection between facial recognition stopping people of certain ethnicity, or the way that it's used at the border? What are the sort of subtleties of are they one and the same?
Technically, you're quite right. They're probably very similar technologies. It's the purpose they're used for that changes. In the case of border control, traditional method, you have to identify yourself. You have a passport which has your photo in it, a whole bunch of things that's been validated to say you are who you claim to be. So adding face to that, I mean, you've got no privacy crossing the border. You can't go across the border without your identity being revealed. And it's also made quite obvious to you, and you even got the choice of going manual or going through the face recognition. So, I'd say that's quite ethical. And it's the main purpose for that was to allow very large numbers across the border with identity validation. So if you think, whereas in the other case of identifying ethnicity, the people aren't aware of it. They aren't aware it's being done. It's all done covertly. They haven't consented to it. So in the case of a border crossing, you've consented to the face recognition. In the case of identifying ethnic minorities, they haven't consented. And at the heart of ethics is always this concept of consent. That if a person has consented to something, it's quite different from if they haven't consented. And they have to consent, they have to be knowingly consent, they have to know what's going on and what it's being used for.
And so what about from the context of building this? How would you say, anyone would say, oh, this is for border control? How would you then stop that from being used for that?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting privacy law, that when you collect data, you can't do what you like with it. You have to tell people what you're going to do with it and then do that. So if you're doing this ethically, you'd say we're using face recognition for border control and that's it. And it's not going to be used and sold off to Facebook or something like that. It's unethical to repurpose data. Okay, and it's the same with surveillance video. If you use surveillance video for the workplace safety, You can't use it to spy on employees. And a classic case of that was when the government had there was some Senate committee, I think, and they had there was a leak, and the government accused the opposition of having the leak. And it turned out from surveillance video that what happened is that the chairman had left a version of the report on the table, and one of the reporters actually just grabbed it and walked out with it. And there was a big uproar in the government saying, you're using surveillance footage that was used to protect us, to spy on us in the workplace and cause political damage. That's a repurposing of the data, and that was illegal. So, so you think if you've got the video, you can do what you like with it. That's not true.
You used the word context before, and I think that's a really important concept. And unfortunately, different people have different views of what context is good and what context is bad. And so if I asked everyone in this room, who do you trust less, the government or a big corporation? We might get different answers depending upon age and background and so on. If I asked you, do you trust Facebook less than the tax office? We get different answers. And so if you ask that question in Germany, most people would trust the government more than they trust Facebook. If you ask that question in the US, most people would trust Facebook more than the government, and that determines how things get regulated and how laws develop. So if you look at laws in this area, in Germany, they're more favourable to the government and difficult on Facebook. If you look at these laws in the US, they're more difficult on the government and more favourable to Facebook. And what's right and what's wrong, it depends. And you could use all sorts of examples, different ages, different country backgrounds. And so, and it gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning. A hammer could be used for good or bad purposes. And so you might make a hammer to sell to someone to build a house, but it gets purchased by someone who's going to murder someone. So that's where it gets difficult.
Yes, I think we have time just for the last question.
Just to build on that a little bit, when you asked that question in the privacy elected, you got very different answers from before. And I suppose from very good perspectives, I'm wondering whether you think we will find more protection in government and legislation as frameworks, or will we be relying on big companies to gatekeep and choose who has access to them?
So the question is, do you think that we'll be relying on government to regulate face recognition, or will be relying on corporations to kind of gatekeep and make the decisions?
I think that there'll be a mixture as there is today. Certainly, in the last few years, we've seen the rise of the big tech, where big tech is funding its nose at national governments and seems to have a bit of law unto themselves, big money. I don't know where that's going, but face recognition's sort of in the mix. But in Australia, it's interesting. We trust the government with guns, police and so on, and we think that's fine. We don't trust you with guns. And in the US, they have the Second Amendment where they say they trust their citizens to have guns and not just the government to have guns. So it does vary from country to country. In the US, they have guns everywhere, and then they outlaw face recognition for border control in San Francisco. So
some governments are trustworthy and some are not. Some corporations are trustworthy and some are not. And so I think we assume the good in everyone until proved otherwise, and then someone breaks the trust. That's when the law comes in to set it right. So the law deals typically with problems after the event rather than proactively.
Thank you both. It's on 5 now, so that's going to bring us to the close of our session. That was a fantastic discussion. I learned a lot. I just wanted to take the time to thank our panel, Professor Lovell, Professor Swinson, and thank all of you for coming and for submitting your wonderful questions. I did get a note here to not forget to mention that if there are any students here that are interested in AI, including but also beyond face recognition, the AI Collaboratory has a number of opportunities and paid summer research projects and PhD scholarships. So please reach out and get in touch and look for that follow-up email that we'll be sending with information on our future events and this recorded session. So thanks again for all your great questions, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panel. Thank you very much.